Good. All right. Welcome to my channel, The Fantasy Thinker. This is ish, issue number two, episode number two of Book Think that I'm starting here monthly on my channel. And for today's guest, we have Varsha from Reading by the Rainy Mountain. And if you could start off with telling us a little bit about your channel and stuff, and what other projects you got going on as well.
Sure. Yeah, I've got a little YouTube channel, like Jared said. It's called Reading by the Rainy Mountain. My name Varsha means rain in a lot of Indian languages. And I really love the rain. And I live in Seattle where it rains a lot, so that's what I named my channel after. um, and I mostly like to talk about things I love in my favorite books. There, I am trying to start some sort of wrap up thing where I talk about the books I've read, like regardless of how much I love them, in a sort of batch review thing. I haven't started that yet. I might do that sometime soon. Meanwhile, I have started this series on my channel that I'm also publishing as a podcast called Bright Threads in the Tapestry, where I go and look in detail at several passages that I may have highlighted during my reading of a book that I happen to enjoy a lot. I've been having a great deal of fun making those. I'm aiming to get one out each week, one episode out each week. So far, I've been successful at it. I am running late on this week's episode, but I'm hoping to get to it by tomorrow.
Yeah, those have been pretty cool. So I definitely recommend to check those out.
Thanks, Jared. And I really appreciate your comments on them. I was afraid that I'd be sending those out into the void for the most part, but I'm glad if
Yeah.
even one person watches it, that's enough motivation for me to keep going. So thank you for that.
All right. So here on Book Think, I am looking for people to come on and tell me about a book. Pick a specific book to tell me about, and if I happen to have read it before, that's great because then we can talk about spoilers and stuff like that. But if not, then I'm hoping you can convince me to throw it on my list to read as well. And so you picked a trilogy called the Ibis Trilogy
Hmm.
by Amitav Ghosh. Am I saying that right?
Yes. Yeah, Amitav Ghosh. Yeah, but
Ghosh.
yeah.
Okay. All right. So I looked him up. I checked out the Wikipedia page on
Hmm.
him, and it looks like he was born in Calcutta,
Hmm.
grew up in India and Bangladesh and Sri Lanka, and he studied in Delhi and Oxford and Alexandria, and he's the author of a whole bunch of books, um, including the Ibis trilogy,
Hmm.
and he's also won a ton of awards
Yeah.
for writing. Um, and he most latest, I think, was the 2019 Foreign Policy magazine named him one of the most important global thinkers of the preceding decade. That's pretty big kudos. And so, and I've never heard of him. Uh, and so, and I wanted to actually show the covers for the trilogy here. See if I can.
Mm,
Yeah.
yeah.
So that's the trilogy there. Um, it's kind of tough to read because it's kind of small, but uh, so that looks interesting. And so this is historical fiction,
Yes, it's
right?
historical fiction.
And so how did you find out about this series?
So, when I was little, I think in school, I'd go, my uncle would take me book shopping with him and he'd buy me some books and buy himself some books. Um, and this one time I was out with him, he bought himself, I believe he bought himself Sea of Poppies. And I remembered that. And whenever my uncle picks a book and really likes it, I tell myself, when I am older, I'm going to read those books. He influenced a lot of my reading that way. So then when I remembered to, I went and looked up Amitav Ghosh and Sea of Poppies. I at the time I was only reading a series if they were finished. So, and Sea of Poppies, I think only River of Smoke and Sea of Poppies had been out at the time. I forget if River of Smoke is the second or third book. The ordering here suggests that it's the third, but I think Flood of Fire is the third, if I remember correctly.
Yeah,
Anyway,
that's right.
just
Yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
yeah. two, two of those, only two had been out, and I was waiting for the third book to come out. And meanwhile, I read other Amitav Ghosh books. I had read The Hungry Tide, which I thought was beautiful and very lyrical and meditative, and it's set in in Bengal. I forget what are those forests called. Start with an M. I'll try and recall, but I think there's this sort of swampy area in Bengal with this special plant that grows in the tropical ocean regions. I went to see it recently, to not in Bengal but in a different part of the country. But it's set there, and it's a really beautiful setting. And they're chasing a tiger or something. It's there's a journalist who's the main character. I forget most of it. I read it a long time ago, and I really loved it. But what really captivated me to Ghosh's writing was The Glass Palace. I read it in a span of 3 days. I think it's a 500-page long book, or the copy that I had at the time was. And I read it in 3 days. I didn't expect to like it that much. Like, I was still a kid trying out adult books in my mind. Although I was in college, but like I was trying out an adult book to see if I would like it. And I loved it so much. It was so beautifully written. Once again, I don't remember most of the plot. So when the Ibis Trilogy was finally completed, I immediately went and started reading it.
Oh,
Um,
nice.
I may have taken a few years, but like I when I remember to look if it's done, started reading it. I read the trilogy in one shot, and it's absolutely brilliant in my opinion. I think it's fairly popular because it's historical fiction. It tends to be more popular than um, fantasy books tend to be,
Mm.
but I
Yeah,
guess
these days. Yeah, yeah.
yeah, yeah. But it does have a significant readership from what I understand, but no one talks about it on BookTube. And I, based on what I know you like, I think this might be something you enjoy. So I wanted to pitch this to you.
All right. So, um, oddly enough, I have not read much historical fiction
Hmm.
at all. Because it's either fantasy or actual history,
Mm,
and I haven't gone into that realm of historical fiction yet. Not that I haven't wanted to. It's just, well, there's a lot to read out there. You know
yeah.
that. But so this first book, The Sea of Poppies,
Mhm.
can you tell us like about some of the actual history surrounding the story that goes into this book?
Yeah, I think the trilogy as a whole, it covers a period just before the first Opium War, which I believe that led to the secession of Hong Kong to the British by China. Um,
Okay.
so I think I haven't read a lot of history. It's been on my to-do list since I finished this
Yeah.
trilogy. I want to read more history
So that's
surrounding this. Sorry.
colonial era then,
Yes, colonial
for
era.
British colonial era. Okay.
In
Yep.
India and China. I
Yep.
believe it's somewhere around the 1700s, even
Okay.
when I looked up the first Opium War. But yeah, interestingly, Amitav Ghosh has a book coming out next year in which he details his research for this trilogy and
Oh,
more history about the Opium War. That's on my list. And I just found out about it today when I was trying to remind myself about this trilogy to talk about it here with you. Um, but yeah, so everything I know is from reading this book, so I could be way off base here, but it is based on a lot of historical research that Ghosh has done around the first Opium War. So, and the war is actually in the third part of it. The events leading up to the war, I don't think we actually see the war, but it follows a lot of characters who were affected by the opium trade, and in both in India and China, some characters who represent the British Empire. There's Indian characters. There's characters from China. A significant portion of the trilogy is set in Canton, in the city of Canton, and there's a lot of different settings here too, with like different parts of the world. We'll talk about that when we talk different other things about the book. But in terms of the history itself, so from what I understand. the British had a lot that they wanted to trade with China, but or the East India Trading Company, I suppose. Uh,
Yeah.
but then China didn't want anything in return, so they were trading at a loss with China. But opium they could sell, uh, and the opium trade then in turn drove the other things that they were now able to make a profit because they were able to sell opium to China. There was in theory a ban on opium trade in China, but it wasn't enforced. There was a lot of corruption,
Yeah.
or it was just yeah, it's just on paper ban for a long time. So the opium trade was like pretty, it infiltrated China quite a bit. Was They created a lot of addicts, and so they were able to do a lot of trading there. Eventually, China decided to enforce the ban, so that's what led to the first opium war.
Okay.
And India's portion in all of this was that we follow some of the farmers in this book, in the first book, who used to grow the poppy from which opium was farmed. And so the how the Indian farmers were affected was that they weren't allowed to grow food, and they had to. I think they were only allowed to grow poppy, and and I think they put these farmers in the cycle of debt, where they had to borrow against the land to buy food to eat. And I think the British companies took a big share of the poppies, and they couldn't actually sell it or something like that. I don't know how that relationship came to be between the trading companies and the farmers, but so they were driven into poverty. Like really
Yeah.
well off farmers were driven into poverty there. So we follow some characters who are who are these farmers who are now looking for a better life. So are they try to look for it elsewhere. They know about indentured labor in other places where they think they might have a better life. So they try to take a boat to get to those. I think they go to Mauritius. They're trying to travel to Mauritius. And then we follow some British merchants who trade in opium, how they are really well off during the time when the opium trade was booming. But once the ban was actually enforced, how it
All
hurt
right.
them. Then we follow some Indian merchants who, you know, since it was under colonial rule, it not many Indians could get very could become very well off. But some of them did. They owned ships, and they were also trading in opium at the time. It shows us how they are impacted. It doesn't. It Yeah, it's a lot of exploration of like the impact on the lives of all these people. There are some addicts
Right.
we follow too, and there are some people in Canton who buy from them, and how like it's just a sprawling epic
So
feeling series.
it sounds like there's a whole lot of point of views in here.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, there's a lot of characters that we
Okay.
follow. Yeah,
Uh, which we Malazan fans love. So,
yeah. Exactly.
uh, but the the so how much fiction is involved in this story? Just maybe the characters made up
Yeah,
to
yeah,
and they're just living in these actual historical times, and he's kind of like showing us these events through the character's eyes that he developed for the story.
yeah.
And so what do you think about the story? um what do you think is some of his themes that are running through here that he wants to get across?
So I think with some of them are looking for a better life, like I said.
Mhm.
So there's a thing that I guess fantasy lovers like, which is when we follow multiple threads and and they all converge onto one aspect that leads to a shared destiny somehow. I think fantasy books tend to do that a
Common
lot.
trope, yeah.
Yeah. The first book does that. It shows how all of these different lives converge on this one ship called Ibis, and that's why it's called
Yeah.
the Ibis Trilogy, because the real story starts when they all set off on that boat, and then follows
Okay.
the destiny of that boat as well. So I think what I love um, most about it is I didn't feel like it was painting anyone as a hero or a villain or any clear one bad side. It just depicted a lot of people as victims of their circumstances. So the farmers, for instance, couldn't do much uh, about. They had to eat, so they had to grow poppy. You could look at them as the villains who grew the opium, but no, not really. Or the merchants who were apparently just trying to make money. The I guess the insidiousness of short-term gain over
Yeah,
overlooking the long-term impacts on two entire countries, right?
yeah.
So that I think was for me the most important theme. Like when I love it when authors explore that uh, short-term selfish decisions that tend to impact really larger scale events and economies. And in this case, it was real, right? It's not really a fantasy exploration. Like we
Yeah.
created an entire nation of addicts. We drove several. Um,
Yep.
Farmers to poverty, and probably for generations they took time to recover. So it was yeah, I think that's the theme that I care about the most. But also on a personal level, every character that we meet, I found a reason to connect with them. I thought the characters were really well done,
Okay.
including, I it's interesting that when we write about the colonialists in literature like this, it's easy to paint them as the villain, but there were times when I felt sympathetic towards the British merchants too, for
Yeah.
what they had to go through. So I just
Well,
thought the whole thing was well done. Yeah,
that's a
yeah.
well-rounded
Hmm.
portrayal then, well-rounded
Yeah,
characters.
exactly.
Yeah. And you kind of touched on it right there. I was going to ask, like, how does this story speak to you
Hmm.
personally? And you touched on that a little bit, but is there more? Is more about it that speaks to you on a personal level?
Um, on a personal level, yeah, I think there was just a lot that was new to me. I think the thread that stands out the most to me was the story of a recovering addict, and there's one character who helps him because he's sort of so one guy is, it's a slight spoiler, I hope that's okay, but there's
That's fine.
one person who's a criminal and the other is an addict and sort of a criminal, I guess, for that reason. And in this ship, those two are locked together, and the addict obviously does not have access to opium during the time they are traveling, so he's dealing with withdrawal and a lot of terrible symptoms because of that. So this friendship that develops between and the other person, he's stuck with him, so he's like, I might as well deal with this and help him recover on a personal level. So they develop this really deep friendship that I really admire. So it felt like a very deep and empathetic look at the struggle of addiction and how to deal with it in a sympathetic way, and how um, um, what you can accomplish with just a lot of compassion, right? So that was a thread that spoke to me the most, I think.
Yeah, that sounds like a very compelling situation, especially.
Hmm.
I mean, all the people on this boat, do they all start out strangers, or do some
Yes,
already know? They
yes,
all do.
yeah,
Yeah. So that
yeah,
right there is a conflict in the making, really,
right,
for a
yeah,
story to be told, and that seems like a very interesting way to go about it for a writer. You
yeah.
have seems like endless avenues to explore with
Hmm.
that kind of a setup.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It is really well done. And that's the other thing. I am one of those people who claims that I don't like stories set on ships. I think I have to take that back now because I've loved a lot more. I have loved a lot of stories set on boats to for that to be true anymore. But I tend to drag my feet when the setting changes to being on a ship. But this was so well done that it didn't bother me at the time. I hadn't read as much as I have now of ship settings. But
Mhm.
this was, yeah, it just really stole my heart. I think the other thing, like, it's not really related to the story, but when I read authors like Amitav Ghosh and Salman Rushdie, it sort of makes me feel proud. Most of the literature I read is not by Indians, English literature, right? And English is my second language, but I don't know enough of my mother tongue and the other Indian languages I speak to read literature, or to read, like, I can read all the languages that I speak, but I don't read them fast enough to understand. So I have to, like, really make the effort, and I want to eventually. That's one of my goals for myself, to
Oh,
read more Indian literature in Indian language, in Indian language. But these are written in English; they're not translated works, um, and for most Indians, English is a second language. So to see what you can do with that, I really admire and respect them. So it gives me something to look up to, and uh,
that's
try to make a goal. Yeah.
yeah, that's very interesting. That because watching your channel, to me, it seems like you have a very good grasp of the English language, and so because you're reading some very good literature, um, and does and it's kind of interesting that you don't get quite the same understanding about reading uh, your native language, which
Yeah,
which is
yeah.
which is what is it? It's
So Tamil is my mother tongue.
Tamil.
I
Okay.
grew up in the part of the country that speaks Telugu. So I grew up speaking Telugu as well.
Oh,
And
okay.
I had to study Hindi in school. So if I had to rank these in terms of what language I read the most literature in, it must be Hindi, because I studied it in school. And I'm able to read and write Tamil because of the efforts of both my grandmothers. They
That's awesome.
they
Yeah.
they got together to buy me a book in which, so I can read, but when you're, like, just teaching someone a language and they have to read letter by letter, that's what happens when I read Tamil. There is this historical fiction that's been adapted recently. It's called Ponniyin Selvan, and it's absolutely brilliant, the adaptation. And I wanted to read it before I watched the movie, and I tried. I felt like I didn't know a lot of the words because I was reading it like one
Wow.
letter at a time. But then I listened to the
Huh.
audiobook. By the way, it took me half an hour to read what the audiobook narrator read in like
Oh,
3
really?
minutes or something. That was insane. But when I listened to the audiobook, I realized that I actually knew those words. I was just mispronouncing them in my head because I was taking so much effort to string the letters together.
Oh,
I
okay.
think I'll get good at it if I put in the effort, but it's so much easier to read English where I already can, I guess.
Wow. Yeah. I couldn't imagine that. I mean, I took I took quite a few years of the French language,
Hmm.
and I never used it though. So it all kind
Hmm.
of just disappeared
Yeah,
over the
yeah.
years, and I always find that fascinating when people can read in more than one language.
Mm, yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
I wish I could, like, read literature in the other languages. Even Hindi, I read quite slowly compared to English, even though I had it in school for 12 years. So yeah, I guess it's more all about exposure.
Yeah. Yeah. Sure. Does Gosh write in other languages too besides English, or
Not that I know of. If he did, I'd expect it might be in Bengali, but
okay?
I don't know if he does.
Oh,
He
okay. All right.
probably does, but yeah, I don't know.
Okay. Yeah, that's interesting. No, I'm very interested. I mean, the only other Indian author I've read has been Salman Rushdie,
Mhm.
um, and so, but and his writing is very exquisite. So I was, finding another author that from India was actually something I was interested in anyway. So you got me there, uh, and um, but let's tell everybody else, like, why should we read this trilogy?
Um, I guess, so the reason I brought it to recommend to you, so I assume most of the people who watch your channel are fans of fantasy, and historical fiction recommends itself to a lot of fantasy readers for
Sure.
many of the same reasons. It usually has deep set worlds and lots of a sprawling cast of characters.
Mhm.
So I think for that reason, it compares to most epic fantasy you might read because of the number of settings it touches upon. We start in Bengal, we move onto a boat, we go to Canton. There are some other border cities that we touch upon, the names of which I'm now forgetting. I think we also spend some time in Hong Kong. So it's a lot of different settings, and our characters move across the world. And there's people of a lot of different. I want to say races. Is that the right word? Indian, Chinese, half and half, which is interesting. Like I didn't know that some Chinese immigrants moved to India and vice versa.
Mm,
That some Indian immigrants moved to China. I expect all of that is
yeah,
based in history.
yeah.
Um,
No,
so
that's true. That's true
mhm,
because there's a lot more movement of
yeah,
peoples than, especially in history, that uh, than most people realize today.
yeah, yeah, yeah,
It's
yeah.
tons of movement of people. Yeah,
Yeah, it feels isolated now. Like I wouldn't, but yeah, it apparently there was a lot of movement and
yeah.
crossbreeding because of that movement. So there are some settings that are on a boat in a river, on a river in Canton. It's just a lot of different settings, a lot of different characters, and the themes, like I mentioned, are extremely deep and moving. They're not dealt with simplistically at all, and the author has, it appears that he has done a lot of research of the history. And I learned a lot about uh, the history of India and also about China, like how two different nations who were completely
Mm.
somewhat unrelated, I suppose. I mean, we share a border, but I guess there's not a lot of population in that
It's
area. But
very mountainous border, so
hmm,
it's hard to cross. Yeah.
yeah. So yeah, I learned a lot from about the history, and I want to read more for
Well,
this. Mhm,
what part of the like the Poppy War? This is leading up to the Poppy War, right?
mhm.
These books,
The Opium War. I don't know if
Opium
if the
War.
Poppy War is the same thing. I thought Japan was involved in that somehow. I don't know, or maybe
Oh,
not.
this is the opium. This
Yeah,
leads up to the Opium War. Okay.
yeah. Hmm.
Uh, um, what what the war itself, like where exactly does that take place? Is it in India or is it um in China?
Oh, so I think what happened was, again, this is what I know from the books, and not from actual history.
Mhm.
Once the government enforced the ban, so they started, the government, or I guess whoever was ruling China at the time, they
Yeah.
actually enforced the ban.
Mhm.
Um, and they started by confiscating any opium that was coming into Canton. So they banned it, and then there was one particular general who was keen about actually enforcing the ban. Before that, I think they were able to get away with bribing
Yeah.
the generals and
Sure.
letting the trade happen anyway. Um, so when they confiscated the ban, I think the uh, trading companies declared war, and the British Parliament backed that. They said, oh, I think what they demanded was compensation for the opium that was confiscated. um, so and the British Parliament backed them up on that. I
Mhm.
think the actual battles happen in Hong Kong or something, but it started in Canton,
Oh, okay.
from what I can tell in this
Okay. All right.
book.
That's what I was curious
Yeah,
about. Yeah, where
yeah.
the actual
Mhm.
fighting took place. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Oh, okay. That's
And
cool.
yeah, it eventually led to China ceding Hong Kong to the British Empire. I don't know if that happened in the course of this first war or if it was a series of events that led there, but that's what, yeah, if you were wondering who won that exchange.
Yeah, well, I'm kind of curious now because it makes me want to, because I vaguely remember some of this stuff from reading history books. But I've always read history books to have like the bigger picture type of
Mm,
deal, and I never read anything specific about this war. Um, as a history book, it's always been, like I read the history of India, and
mm,
it's
yeah.
mentioned in a page maybe, and,
Mhm.
and then you're moving on to a whole bunch of other stuff, and
Mhm.
so I'm trying to remember if maybe this is how if the British ended up getting Hong Kong as a colony as part of an agreement for or the result of this war, did that lead to this more selling of opium
Mm,
and
yeah.
more, more addiction down the line and stuff like that, because they had that base and that port. And
Mm,
uh,
yeah.
you know so that's fascinating, how that all ties together. So I would be interested in seeing through this historical fiction
Yeah.
all the stuff that would lead up to that kind of result.
Mm, yeah.
uh,
Yeah. I think it doesn't. It sort of ends on the conflict that
yeah,
resulted in the secession of Hong Kong. So it doesn't really follow up from there. What were the consequences of that?
yeah,
Um, but the events leading up to it are still fascinating. Like you mentioned that you look at that you tend to read high level history. The only history I've read was in school. I want to read more now, but uh,
I got a lot of recommendations for you.
yes, I'd like that. We should do a similar discussion on where you give me recommendations on history. um, but what we studied was sort of the about the British colonization of India was mostly tied to the revolution, of the freedom struggle, right? We didn't dig too much into the like. This is something that I didn't study in school about
Mhm.
the effects of farming poppy and the opium trade. So even when I did study some history in detail, these are things that are fascinating that is not widely known about. So that's also why I appreciate this book for sort of bringing it to light
Yeah, yeah.
in certain ways. Yeah.
Well, that's a good reason of why you
Hmm.
should read this book, to bring this kind of thing to light too, because I think it's kind of something that's glossed over
Mm,
in Western society, because colonization tends to get glossed over in high schools too,
mm,
because they don't want to point out the evils of it, even though there's a whole bunch of underlying things behind colonization and stuff that, like this, like the this war, that doesn't put Western societies in the best light.
yeah. Yeah.
So it's very interesting to dive into this kind of stuff that is not normally taught,
Hmm. Yeah.
at a high school level. Of course it's taught in
Yeah.
college and stuff like that, but
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah.
so it's that's very cool. So what other any other things you can think of, like that we can, reasons we need to delve into this trilogy? And what would you, um how would you rate it to some of the other books that you've really liked? Is this like on the top of your list? Is this
I guess I don't rank the books I read. I What I do is put them on a shelf in Goodreads that marks them as my favorite.
oh,
And this
okay.
is sitting up there with some of my other favorites like Malazan and Wars of Light and Shadow recently.
Okay, yeah, that's
And
exactly what I
yeah,
meant. Yeah, yeah.
a lot of Salman Rushdie books are on there as well. Midnight's Children is brilliant. So yeah, it's up there with a lot of my favorite authors. I think uh, he was already one of my favorite authors by the time I had read The Glass Palace, but this just really, um, dug
Oh,
his name deep in it. Like, yeah, planted a flag on my Goodreads shelf.
yeah. And now, is this trilogy, uh like, if I read Sea of Poppies, am I gonna immediately have to read River of Smoke? Because,
I don't think so.
like,
I think each of these gets a decent conclusion. You may want to go between River of Smoke and Flood of Fire. You may feel the need to. I don't think it's necessary because it doesn't end on quite a cliffhanger per se, but I guess the River of Smoke is sort of the beginning of the unrest in Canton and ends at the beginning of that, and then Flood of
okay,
Fire sort of follows through from there, if I remember correctly. It's been like 6 years, so I could be wrong about that, but that's what I seem to recall. That River of
yeah,
Smoke ends not quite on a cliffhanger. I wouldn't classify it that way, but um, it does make you want to pick up the next book straight away. Sea of Poppies, I think, sort of stands on its own a little bit.
a little bit. Yeah, okay. No,
Hmm.
that's good. That's good. Cool. And is this trilogy, is this your favorite from him? Or you mentioned the Glass Palace
The
earlier,
Glass Palace. Yeah,
or is that your absolute favorite? Or
I read that almost 10 years ago, so I'd have to reread it. And I read these far more recently. So,
okay,
in terms of scale and scope, I think I like these more.
okay.
Um, but I think the reason I liked The Glass Palace, or like the reason I read it so intensely, was there were some characters that I really enjoyed following. So, this one is more sprawling epic in that we switch a lot between characters, and there's no one person that I got attached to and wanted nice things to happen for them. It was more just exploration of consequences. From that perspective, I think The Glass Palace might be slightly a bigger favorite, just because I had some characters that I enjoyed following, and I came back to read for the characters. So, uh, yeah, but I haven't reread it recently, so I
Hmm.
don't know if I'll change my mind on that.
And the glass is the Glass Palace also historical fiction?
Yes, yes.
Yes. Okay.
I don't remember what area it covers, but it starts with a coup in Bangladesh, uh, or Myanmar, I think. Uh, and the royal family has to flee because there's a riot, and we follow the fate of that royal family. From, if I remember correctly, I think that's what happens.
Hmm. Back when it was called Burma, right?
Yes. Oh, wait. Yes, yes. Burma, not Bangladesh. Right. You're right. Myanmar. Yes. Burma.
Yeah.
That's, yes.
Yeah,
Messed up my
Myanmar is
countries there.
fairly recent. uh, yeah, cool. All right, so I think I think you convinced me. So
Nice.
I think
Mission
I'm gonna have
accomplished.
to definitely put Sea of Poppies on my list of things to read, ever growing list of things to read. Uh, so and I hope you've convinced other people out there
I hope so.
to pick up this book. And so just to wrap it up, you can tell me once again where we can find you.
You can find me on my YouTube channel, Reading by the Rainy Mountain. The About page has other ways to reach me. I'm also publishing Bright Threads in the Tapestry as a podcast. I think it's available on Apple, Google, and Amazon, the podcast platforms, where whatever they have. Yeah, that's it. Those are all the places.
All right, and so thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you so much
And
for having me. This was a lot of fun.
yeah, and I'll definitely be talking to you in the future soon. I think tomorrow actually.
Yeah, tomorrow.
But but so everybody out there, thank you for joining us, for joining me on book think number 2, and and be good to each other.